Last year, we had Joe Nye and Harry Harris on the podium, Mr. Soft Power and Mr. Hard Power. And I asked the same question to both of them, which was China, friend or foe? And Harry said, I think China is a great friend of the United States. I also believe in the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny. So, and then he gave us a pretty comprehensive rundown. Joe, as you might imagine, was a little more professory and nuanced. So I wanted to throw that same question to you if I could. China, friend or foe?
China's an adversary, in my view. That's what I describe her as. This is not necessarily a foe. If we have good diplomacy, this is what our diplomats are supposed to do. Keep an adversary from becoming an enemy. But we don't have the only say in that. China's got to make some basic decisions herself.
Xi Jinping becoming president for life, that's bad news, good news, or doesn't make a difference?
Well, I guess I ought to say it's a Chinese decision. So having said that, I think it's probably not a wise one. It's not wise because after Mao, China made their own decision. They didn't want to put all that power in one person's hand. And now they're going back and concentrating it all in one person's hand, president for life. So I could make the argument, I won't, I'm not foolish, and I know you're not foolish, but I could make the argument some in China make that it is more efficient to have Xi Jinping as president and the only guy who makes a decision. It's also dangerous, I think. It's dangerous because he'll probably surround himself with the yes men. He won't get the advice he needs to fully understand a problem or a course of action. And it's also dangerous because I happen to think that the president of China doesn't have, I was talking to Admiral Swift earlier, and said that I believe Xi Jinping does not have a nautical term, that is much freeboard. He doesn't have much room for error. Having put himself in charge of everything important in China, he's got nobody to throw under the bus. So in the longer view, I think Xi Jinping is probably made in error.
Thank you. We talked a little bit today at lunch about the various threats that the U.S. faces, and the national security strategy this year sort of laid out three primary threats. One was revisionist powers, China and Russia. One was sort of rogue states with nuclear ambitions, North Korea and Iran, and then transnational terrorism, crime, and all of that. What it didn't do is prioritize those and say, which is, what's the real threat that we ought to be worried about as Americans?
I get asked all the time, aren't we in terrible shape? Isn't the world a mess? It's so chaotic out there. Have we ever been worse? And as a matter of fact, the world's been much worse. World War II was worse. The 80s, during the Reagan administration, we had 4 or 5 active wars, the beginning of terrorism. Marine Corps barracks was bombed in Lebanon. It's been much worse. And you can go back all through history and find that it's been worse. And the other side of that coin is you, me, none of us have an existential threat today. Because to have an existential threat, you have to have the capability and the intention to destroy us. Well, China certainly has the capability, but she doesn't have the intention. Too much skin in the game, I believe, right now. Russia has the capability, doesn't have the intention either. Iran, I believe, does not have the intention, nor do they yet have the capability. The same is probably true in terms of capability for North Korea. There is one actor out there, however, that would love to destroy us. They have the intention, they have not the capability, and that's ISIS. So I think that we don't have the luxury of prioritizing, because should the balloon go up, we're going to turn to the Admiral and I've seen Lieutenant General here, others, and we're going to ask them to go take care of the problem, whatever it is. And it might be a force-on-force problem, it might be terrorism problem, it might be a rogue state. So to prioritize them probably is troublesome, because when we prioritize, our enemies know that as well. And so they will act against they're not going to hit us strength on strength, they'll hit us where we're not. So I really am loath always to prioritize threats. It's bad business. It can only lead to problems for us.
You are a leading authority on Asia policy and spent much of your life crafting it. I wonder if you could tell us from your perspective, the current administration, what is it doing right in Asia?
Are you also going to ask me what they did wrong?
That'll be the
Okay.
second question.
Well, look,
The easy one first.
What they've done right, I think, clearly, is that the president went to the EAS and the APEC. There was some question at the beginning of his administration whether he'd do that, and he did it. And I think I have to give our president his props for that. Beyond that, there hasn't been much right in Asia. But as I think I said to Barbara Tanabe earlier tonight, if one moves aside the tweets of our president and the language and the boorishness of his behavior and just concentrate on his foreign policy, it's kind of like the music of Wagner. It's better than it sounds. And that's kind of right, as he hasn't changed very much. I mean, he griped about NATO. He talks about removing forces from Korea, getting out of course, but we haven't done it. So in a very real way, it's like the music of Wagner.
Now the second half. What do you think have been the biggest or the bigger mistakes in Asia?
Well, the biggest mistake clearly is TPP and the decision not to go in, but to be fair, Mrs. Clinton, had she prevailed, would have done the same thing. Then the blame for this, Ralph, actually falls on people like you and me. And it falls on us because we always concentrate in trade policy, at least I always did, I'll let you speak for yourself, concentrate on trade policy on the winners. And at least as far as I'm concerned, none of the trade decisions that we've made when I was in government didn't have a majority of our people winning, but we never gave the thought to the losers, the people who didn't win because of a trade agreement. And so now we've sown the whirlwind, and now we're reaping the storm for a while, temporarily. But it's this whole TPP thing is probably, in my view, the worst decision. Now, there's a second one. I guess you're going to get to it, but I'll let you talk about Korea in a minute.
No, give us the second worst, please.
Well, my enthusiasm is dramatically under control for the bigger button meeting that's allegedly going to take place in May. I think this is fraught with disaster. And the reason I say that is, first of all, we've not heard a thing from the North Koreans. Not officially, not a word. Now, on the one hand, I can see why would Kim Jong-un want to have a word about this? There's no need to. He can sit back and watch the bodies fall in Washington as the Secretary of State gets fired. The National Security Advisor is rumored to be fired. Who knows about John Kelly as Chief of Staff? So why should he speak about anything? He doesn't know what team he's going to be dealing with. So he'll just kind of watch these, as I say, the bodies fall for a while and see what comes out of it. Second, we know from our South Korean envoys what the North Koreans said and what Kim Jong-un said. But what we don't know, as my grandmother would say, is a matter of emphasis. Where was the emphasis? And without hearing the emphasis, the raw words don't convey, I think, the full feeling of whatever it was that Kim Jong-un said. Third, the South Korean envoys told us that among the many things that surprised them was how well-versed on North-South issues, how well-versed on regional issues, and how well-versed on international issues was Kim Jong-un. I think they were, I'll put words in their mouth, they were a bit surprised. I must say I'm a bit surprised, but I guess you can think about it. He can get CNN, he can get whatever networks he wants and kind of stay abreast of what's going on. The other side of that is the whole situation with North Korea has subtleties, has historical context that must be understood and taken into consideration. And whatever we want to say, I'll have to say that I don't think our president thus far has shown that he's got the temperament to engage on this kind of unscripted, unrehearsed situation, nor necessarily does he have the willingness to learn. So that's a situation that leaves us with one option, and that option is Japan. And we're counting what Foreign Minister Kono came into town last Friday, and he saw Secretary Mattis and some others around town, and I guess his concerns were part of these subtleties that I was talking about. His concerns are short-range ballistic missiles. Oh, that's a great surprise. If you live in Japan, you're going to be concerned about SRBMs and abductees. These are issues that wouldn't even get on the table unless Kono-sensei, and later in the 18th of April or so, Mr. Abe, when he comes to Washington, didn't lay these in front of our president. So I would be one that would say I'd be delighted if this occasion passed by without this meeting. It's not ready yet, in my view. It's not ripe. The fruit is not hanging low enough to be picked. The spade work hadn't been done. The gardening hadn't been done. The other side of that is, I'm afraid this would be, if you think about it, the most watched TV event ever. And I think that's got an attraction for our president, because something like that would knock everything else off the headlines, if you get my drift.
You just mentioned Japan, and one of the questions was about Prime Minister Abe. How much trouble is he in? Can he sustain the current challenges, and how does he play in the North Korea issue?
About 10 days ago, I was in Tokyo, and it was right when the finance ministry person resigned and the Treasury official committed suicide. I was having dinner with the Deputy Prime Minister, and he actually was late for the dinner because he was giving a 2-hour press conference. There was so much interest in this. And at the time, I must say, the whole situation surrounding the Morimoto Gakuen Osaka school looked pretty dicey, or as I said, I think at lunch today, pretty gnarly. My sense is, and a couple of the newspapers, Asahi, Mainichi, they're really digging at the Prime Minister. They don't have any other thing to hit the Prime Minister with. The opposition is splintered, has no policies of their own, on the one hand. On the other hand, unless there's a new revelation and a big revelation, I think they've weathered the worst of this. There is some Abe fatigue. Mr. Abe understands that. I think everyone understands that. It happens in every democracy. But the other side of that is, who else is there right now? And there doesn't seem to be much. So I would say, Ralph, I think he's weathered it, unless there's a new revelation. I think, however, he will be challenged in the September LDP presidency race, and I think he'll prevail. But he will be challenged. He will, I think, end up being the longest post-war prime minister in Japan's history. He will preside over what I have no doubt will be a successful Olympics. And their situation with North Korea is changing almost daily. The situation I mentioned with Foreign Minister Kono coming and raising the issues, the short-range missiles and abductees, is very much politically on the minds of our friends in Tokyo. And I think Mr. Abe feels that he has to come and raise and be seen as raising the issues of great concern to the people of Japan. And now I've read today that Mr. Abe also wants to meet with Kim Jong-un. So I don't know where, but that's not unprecedented. Koizumi has met with him in the early part of George Bush 43's administration.
Rich, I've got 2 or 3 questions that essentially are what's going on with One Belt, One Road? How is that going to impact the U.S.? What's China up to?
Well, if you'd asked me that question 6 weeks ago or so, before the People's Congress, I'd have said, oh yeah, every time Xi Jinping opens his mouth, he talks about One Belt, One Road, a huge infrastructure program, et cetera, et cetera. In the last month, they've been very quiet about this. And I think the reason is kind of twofold. The first and most important was the People's Congress. And Xi Jinping had to consolidate this presidency for life, and I think that's where his whole focus was. The second reason has to do with a little headwind that China ran into in Central Asia. The Russian Federation has some views about former satellites of hers in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of slowed down some of the One Belt, One Road. This gives me an opportunity, however, to bring up something. Tomorrow, our president will announce his tariffs on China, and it'll be strong, and it will be combined with at least a limited petition to the WTO. So there's going to be tough tariffs, but there'll be some obeisance paid to the WTO. China will react. I can't tell you how China will react, and maybe she'll react without saying anything. Just buy less sorghum, less soybeans, fewer cattle, and fewer pigs. Buy them from Argentina, buy them from somewhere else. There are plenty of suppliers. Without saying a word. That would be the best we could expect. The worst, I think, would be a somewhat harsher reaction. It could even evidence itself in some pressure on Taiwan. I'm not talking about invasion or anything like that, but some pressure, more pressure on Taiwan. One thing you can take to the bank is our markets will react negatively tomorrow. And I don't think it'd be long-lived, but they will react. The markets will go down tomorrow, I think almost certainly. And I think that's what happened at the tail end of today. But this gives me an opportunity, forgive my length, to bring up something. I'm not, as I did at lunch, I'm not going to talk about security issues in China. You live here. You're right in the middle of it. You probably, with a combination of the Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force team out here, Army, you hear about the security challenges all the time. But there's an economic aggression coming from China. There's a coercive economics that they're engaged in. And wherever you look around the world, you will find China engaged in coercive economics. Japan, rare earth. Taiwan, tourism, to restrict tourism. Norway, tried to bully Norway for hosting the Nobel Prize winner, the chair for the Nobel Prize winner. Sri Lanka, anywhere you look, Cambodia, it's economic coercion. And this is part of what the administration of Washington is trying to get the attention of the Chinese on.
You've covered North Korea to a certain extent, but lots more questions about North Korea. Bloody nose, does that make sense? Do we need to preempt? How do we handle it if North Korea, in fact, gets nuclear weapons and starts deploying them?
Well, I thought the bloody nose was a little overhyped for a while. And, of course, now the administration is running from that terminology like a scalded cat. Secretary Mattis and Tillotson at the time were dead against it. Mr. McMasters, or General McMasters, and the President were alleged to be mildly for it. And the concept was we could get away with a very discreet strike. This was the stated context. To take out a certain facility. Well, that's a little facile. That presupposes that we know the response mechanisms of the North Koreans, and I don't think we do. At least we never did when I was the Deputy Secretary, and I doubt that we know it now. Second, that Kim Jong-un would have perfect understanding that we're just trying to solve one small problem and to send a message, something that is questionable. And third, it's a very big bet that you're making, a very big bet that there won't be a response, there won't be a misunderstanding, and that our 100,000 citizens in Seoul, and the Japanese more than 10,000 citizens, our soldiers, our service people, and Republic of Korea citizens would be completely unharmed in all of this. It boggles the mind, that, in my view, that people thought about it. And Victor Cha has written about it, and very persuasively, thank God. The question of nuclear weapons, I'm not sure what we're going to quite do. I personally favor a very hyped up covert action. I was never a person who wanted regime change. I wanted to change the regime. You guys all know the lingo. I'm no longer there. I don't think we can have much worse than we've got now. And besides, we may not have a say in it. This is a guy, Kim Jong-un, who's about 4 inches or 5 inches shorter than I am and weighs about 100 pounds more. Now, that is fairly unseemly. This is why you generally see pictures of him from the front, because if you get him from the side, oh my God. But he's not suicidal. if he's anything, he's hedonistic. This guy likes his life. He likes his whiskey, I'm sure. He likes his cheese. Likes some other things as well. So he's not suicidal. So, but I think the only way we can get this character and change things is to keep working on the covert issue, as I don't think a military strike, except in reaction, is a good thing. And finally, I hate to bring this up, and I'm not, people would never accuse me of being too pristine when I was in office on these matters, but there is a matter of international law. Under international law, a preemptive strike is okay on a threat that you know with certainty is going to come your way or your allies' way. But a preemptive war is not. It is not legal. Now, that's a nicety maybe people want to ignore, but I don't think the international community would necessarily ignore it. So.
We have a couple of questions about the southern half of the peninsula, the advisability of keeping U.S. forces there. Are we treating President Moon like an ally? And where do you see the Moon Kim Jong-un talks going? If they agree to some type of a confederation, how do we deal with that?
Well, as lacking of enthusiasm as I am for a Kim 3 Trump meeting, I have very much enthusiasm for Kim 3 Moon Jae-in meeting. And I think this is a very good first start. And we'll get a lot of intelligence out of it. We'll learn what they have to say. Japan will learn what they have to say. So I'm very bullish on it. Should we keep U.S. forces in Korea? Well, look, we just gave Kim Jong-un, at least rhetorically, something that his grandfather and his father sought for years and years. A meeting, equal standing, as it were, for the U.S. president? It's not equal. But what are the North Korean citizens going to see? Huh? So we gave that away for free. I wouldn't want to give away the removal of troops for free. Now, is this wise to remove troops from Korea? I'd say no. The linchpin for us, and we'll use whatever term you want, is Japan. And if we had no forces on the Republic of Korea, this puts quite a bit of pressure, could put quite a bit of pressure on Japan for their hosting of U.S. forces and our use of their bases. So for both of those reasons, and finally, could very well be misread in the North as a weakness and a provocation. It was June 1950 when the last time we encountered this problem, when like several months earlier, our Secretary of State said Korea was outside of our defense perimeter, hence an attack. So,
we'll step back from Asia for an interesting question. I found that our questioner says that many people believe that the deep state controls the government. What's your view? Are you a member of the deep state, I guess we need to ask?
Well, if I wasn't, I would be now. My experience has been there's not a deep state. There is a sometimes hidebound bureaucracy. There's no question about that. And sometimes this bureaucracy makes it difficult for people to do things. I've never seen a president, and I've served a lot of them, who didn't at one time or another rub up against the State Department and say, those guys, every time I want to do something, they stop me. Well, there's another way to say that. Every time the president wants to do something, maybe some in the State Department have a view that he needs to listen to. They're not always right, but at least they've got a view. They've got the historical context, etc. So I can see where people think there is a deep state. I've never actually seen it. At the end of the day, people who work in our bureaucracy, and I can't speak for the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Transportation, any of that, but State, Defense Department, CIA, the civilians, they go to work in the morning and think they're doing the Lord's work, the government's work, and the people's work. And I'm mighty thankful for them.
Final question. What should I have asked you that I failed to? What sort of closing comments or points would you like to make that we weren't smart enough to ask?
Ralph, the combination of you and the audience, I think you covered the issues here in Asia quite well. But when we have a discussion of the difficulties and the problems that we have now, let me tell you a story. I told it at lunch. I, at one time, had, among other things, responsibilities for the Middle East. Used to go to Israel quite often. A lot of interactions with Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin. And one day I went complaining about something or other to Shimon Peres, who's now passed, and said, Shimon, got so many crises out there. It's just terrible. And he looked at me and said, in his sort of Israeli accented English, which we don't have crises. We have problems. These are problems which we must resolve. Crisis, that is war. So I was chagrined, embarrassed, and moved on to the next topic. We don't have crisis of war right now, and I don't think we should take counsel of our fears. So I think the question you should have asked, or could have asked, maybe put it that way, Ralph, is how are we going to get out of this temporary spiral that we're in right now? And my own view is the first place we get out of, how we get out of it, is to realize that, you know, this could be a real spiral, and it's not. It's ugly. It may not be efficacious, but think about what is working. Our judicial system is working. Our courts are working. When the present administration has attempted to overstep, the courts have stepped in, and they've said, hold it, let's take a look at this. This was what was envisioned by our founding fathers. Look at the press. You can say, talk about fake news and all of this other stuff, but the readership of the major organs in the United States has gone way up. As the Washington Post says, and that's what Ollie North used to call the Washington compost, the fact of the matter is they get at the facts as often as not, and on their masthead they have now the saying, democracy dies in darkness. So we've got some things that are working. If you travel around, if you stay in Washington, you're going to have an awfully unhappy life. But if you go out and travel in our country, you see people actually want to make decisions. You have mayors who run to be mayor to make decisions, and governors of states who actually want to do things. Oh my God, this is so novel. But you have to get out of Washington. You have to pull your head out of the bucket to see that there's a lot going on in this country. Look at those Parkland students. Don't care where you come down on the gun issue. I've got guns. Probably most of us have some, or many of us. But those Parkland students are articulate. They're motivated. They're going to come to Washington on Saturday, and I hope march in the hundreds of thousands, because this is people that are coming behind us. These are people who are going to take up that banner for us. They're going to stop the spiral. The spiral may start to stop in 2018, depending on how the elections come out. And this coming from someone who used to be a Republican. So, Ralph, I think we need to take a little time, we should, all of us, to think what's going right in our country, because there's plenty going right. And there's no reason for long-term pessimism. There is a reason, however, to realize that we've got to be engaged in this struggle, every single one of us. Thank you.